Was scratching my dog's ears when my brother Eric texted, "Thanks for letting me watch the dog last weekend." I froze. I hadn't asked Eric to watch my dog Baxter. When I called Eric immediately, he answered on the first ring, breathing hard. "Look, I can explain everything, but... Eric, what did you do to my dog?" "Nothing bad, okay? Just trust me until next month, please." His voice cracked. That night, our sister Julia called from Seattle, her voice strained and urgent. "Have you noticed anything different about Baxter?" My blood ran cold. "Julia, what do you know?" "Just don't leave him alone with Eric anymore. And whatever you do, don't check Eric's basement. Not yet." 2 weeks passed. Baxter, who used to bolt at the sight of nail clippers, now sat perfectly still during grooming. This was the same dog who once ate through a door to escape bath time. When I mentioned it to Eric at dinner, he went rigid. "Dogs change," he said, not touching his food. I was doing laundry when I found one of Baxter's collars in my jacket pocket. Not his regular collar, an expensive leather one with metal studs I'd never seen before. When I showed it to Eric, his face drained of color. "Oh, that's from the pet store. I was going to buy it as a gift, but forgot to put it back." He grabbed it from my hands and shoved it in his pocket. At 3 a.m., I heard Eric on the phone in the garage, voice muffled but urgent. I know. But I can't keep doing this. 7 is too many." A pause. "My brother will never forgive me when he finds out what I've been training them for." "You know he won't." Baxter came back from Eric's with a small shaved patch on his inner thigh. "Vet needed to draw blood," Eric said, pulling his sleeve down to cover something on his wrist. Routine stuff. But when Baxter walked, there was a slight hesitation in his gait. He still did his clumsy full-body tail wag when he saw me, but now it looked limp, like joy cost him effort. Every time I needed to travel for work, Eric was suddenly available to watch Baxter. Every time I offered to pay him, he refused with increasing panic. "No money between family," he'd say, his hands shaking. The worst part came when Baxter stopped responding to his name for 3 seconds before turning, like he was listening for something else first. "Did you rename my dog?" I confronted Eric. "Why would you even think that?" He screamed, then immediately apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm just stressed about work stuff." Eric quit his accounting job, but somehow afforded a new truck. When I asked how, he muttered something about private consulting. His browser history showed hundreds of searches for dog behavioral modification and classical conditioning responses. One tab was still open. How to make them forget their original, before it cut off. I found peanut butter under Baxter's claws. Not messy, applied in perfect grid patterns like someone had used a brush. Each paw had exactly 3 lines. My hands trembled as I drove to Eric's house at midnight, using the spare key. Woof, woof, woof. The basement was full of dogs. 7 of them, all sitting in perfect formation. Each had a number shaved into their fur. Men in suits were filing in and out with smirks plastered on their faces. Something felt very, very wrong. One man patted me on the shoulder and said, "You should try it with number 1, before walking out. I tried to blend in looking for Baxter, and eventually found him hiding under the table. His mouth was stretched wide with a tool I didn't recognize, and he immediately ran over to me. His eyes had tears that broke my heart in 2. The more I looked around, the more rage boiled my blood. "Eric, where the F are you?" He immediately ran out, recognizing my voice. He tried to mumble something about a side hustle while escorting me out. But that wasn't good enough anymore. I needed answers. And when he realized I wasn't leaving, he finally caved. "I'm sorry. Forgive me," he said with tears streaming down his face. Bile rose in my throat. "Eric, what did you do?" He couldn't even look at me. It all happened so fast. Debt collectors came, I lost my job, they told me this was an easy way of earning money. I realized he wasn't going to tell me the truth himself and looked around. In each room, dogs I didn't recognize were chained to the walls, and when I heard someone groaning through the drywall, my heart sank. I followed the sound, and there it was, a man around the same age as me, playing with a dog who lay on the floor, whimpering helplessly. Eric came up behind me. His hand grabbed my shoulder, but I spun around and shoved him hard into the wall. Baxter was still under that table, and I needed to get him out now. I ran past the man on the floor and dropped to my knees, pulling Baxter toward me. That metal thing fell from his mouth with a clatter. His whole body shook as I lifted him up. Eric tried to block the doorway, but I lowered my shoulder and slammed into him. We both stumbled, but I kept moving. The men in suits started yelling behind us. My hands fumbled with my keys at the car. Baxter whimpered against my chest. The engine started, and I peeled out of the driveway. My phone was already dialing the emergency vet clinic 3 miles away. The receptionist answered, and I told her we were coming with an abused dog. She said they would be ready. Baxter stayed curled in the passenger seat, not moving except to shake. His breathing came in short gasps. The clinic parking lot was empty at this hour. Teresa Hart stood at the door waiting with a gurney. She took one look at Baxter and her face went hard. We got him inside and she started checking him over. The marks around his mouth were deep and red. She measured them and took photos. The shaved patch on his leg had needle marks. She drew blood and checked his gums. I stepped outside to let her work. My hands were still shaking as I pulled out my phone. The video started recording and I talked about everything. 7 dogs in that basement, all sitting in perfect rows, numbers shaved into their fur like they were products. The men in suits coming and going. That man behind the wall doing things to that poor dog. My voice cracked when I described finding Baxter with that tool in his mouth. The video went on for 12 minutes. I saved it 3 times to make sure it didn't delete. Julia picked up on the second ring when I called her. I told her about the basement and the dogs and Eric's lies. She went quiet for so long I thought the call dropped. Then she admitted Eric had called her months ago asking about dog training methods. He wanted to know how to make dogs do things they didn't want to do. She thought maybe he was just curious, but something felt wrong. She should have said something sooner. Teresa opened the door and waved me back inside. Baxter was on the exam table with an IV in his leg. She showed me the injection sites on his inner thigh. At least 6 different needle marks in various stages of healing. His blood work showed traces of sedatives. The behavioral signs were all there too. She had seen this in fighting dogs, but this was different, more systematic. She said we needed to file a police report right away. The evidence was clear. I stayed with Baxter while he slept off the sedatives Teresa gave him for the exam. His paws twitched like he was running in his dreams. Little whimpers came from his throat. I sat in that plastic chair all night watching him breathe. The clinic was quiet except for the beeping machines. Morning came and I called my boss to say I was sick. The police station was only 10 minutes away. Detective Rebecca Quigley met me in the lobby. She was older with gray hair and sharp eyes. We sat in a small room and I told her everything. She took notes and asked questions. When I mentioned the 7 dogs, she leaned forward. This was bigger than just Baxter. She said they would need more evidence for a warrant, though. My phone still had those photos from weeks ago. Eric's browser history with all those searches about dog training and conditioning. I had taken pictures when he left his laptop open. The email went through and Detective Quigley printed everything out. She said it helped establish a pattern, but they needed more concrete proof. My phone started buzzing with texts from Eric. He was sorry and begging me to answer. The messages kept coming, each one more desperate. He mentioned his situation and his obligations. I screenshot every single text without responding. Detective Quigley said to keep doing that. Any communication from him could be evidence. After 20 texts, I decided to respond. I played dumb and asked what was really going on. Eric wrote back about dangerous people and owing money. He had to provide services or they would hurt him. The details were vague but revealing. I forwarded the entire conversation to Detective Quigley immediately. She said this was exactly what they needed to build the case. More texts came through from Eric, but I didn't answer again. 2 hours later, Teresa called while I was still at the police station. She had the full lab results from Baxter's blood work and wanted me to hear them right away. The report showed 3 different sedatives in his system, all at low doses but combined for maximum effect. She explained these were the same drugs she'd seen in fighting dog cases years ago, but the combination was more sophisticated. The drugs would make dogs compliant without knocking them out completely. She'd documented everything in a formal report and was sending copies to Detective Quigley and me. The injection sites on Baxter's leg matched veterinary needles, but the pattern suggested repeated use over weeks. She said this evidence would be crucial for building a case against whoever was doing this. Detective Quigley printed out Teresa's report and added it to the growing file. After leaving the station, I drove straight to my apartment to search for anything Eric might have left behind. He'd been coming over for months to pick up Baxter, and sometimes stayed for dinner. I started in the guest room where he'd crashed a few times when he was too drunk to drive home. Under the bed, I found a crumpled receipt from a storage facility on the other side of town. The unit number was circled in pen, and someone had written Thursday 8 p.m. in the margin. In the closet pocket of a jacket Eric had borrowed, I found more papers with weird notes about training schedules and product delivery. One page had 7 columns with numbers at the top and check marks in various boxes below. I took photos of everything with my phone before putting each item in a plastic bag. The storage receipt seemed important, so I texted the photo to Detective Quigley immediately. She called back within minutes asking if I'd found anything else. When I described the papers with columns and check marks, she got excited and said to bring everything to the station. The next morning, Detective Quigley asked me to come in for a meeting. She sat across from me in the interview room and explained what they needed next. The evidence was building, but they needed someone on the inside to get more details. She wanted me to wear a wire and meet with Eric. The idea made my stomach turn, but those 7 dogs were still trapped in his basement. We spent the next hour going over what to say and what information they needed. She showed me how the wire worked, a tiny device that would clip inside my shirt. The tech guy tested it 3 times to make sure the signal was clear. Detective Quigley gave me a list of questions to work into conversation naturally. I texted Eric saying we needed to talk and suggested the coffee shop downtown. He agreed immediately and said he'd be there in an hour. My hands were shaking as I parked outside the coffee shop. Eric was already there in a corner booth and he looked terrible. His hair was greasy and uncombed. Dark circles under his eyes made him look sick. His hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup. He started talking before I even sat down, rambling about losing his job 3 months ago. The accounting firm had downsized and he was one of the first to go. He'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone. Then came the gambling to try to make quick money. When that failed, the loan sharks showed up at his door. They gave him 2 choices, pay up or work it off. The dog thing started as a one-time favor, but they kept demanding more. Every word was recorded by the wire against my chest. I asked who they were, and Eric's face went white. He looked around the coffee shop before leaning in closer. He whispered about someone called the organizer who ran everything from the shadows. This person never showed their face but sent orders through encrypted messages. Eric pulled out his phone to show me, but then thought better of it and put it away. He said there was an event planned for tomorrow night, and he had to deliver all 7 products or face consequences. The word products made me want to throw up, but I kept my face neutral. He explained how the organizer had clients who paid big money for specially trained dogs. Some wanted guard dogs, others wanted something else he wouldn't specify. The 7 in his basement were supposed to be delivered tomorrow at midnight. If he didn't show up with all of them, the organizer had promised to hurt him. I asked more questions about the organizer and the clients, but Eric kept looking at the door like someone might walk in. After 40 minutes, I said I had to go, and Eric grabbed my wrist. His grip was desperate as he begged me not to tell anyone what he'd said. I pulled away and left without looking back. Detective Quigley was waiting in an unmarked car 2 blocks away. I got in, and she immediately praised how well I'd done. The recording was clear, and they'd gotten everything they needed. She said they had enough for a warrant, but timing was crucial. If they moved too early, the organizer and clients would disappear. She wanted to wait until tomorrow night when everyone would be at Eric's house for the delivery. She assigned a surveillance team to watch Eric's house starting immediately. They would track every vehicle and person who came and went. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about those 7 dogs waiting in that basement. Baxter was curled up next to me on the bed, finally relaxed after days of stress. I made a decision to take him somewhere safe while everything went down. My friend Sarah was a vet tech who lived an hour away. I called her early the next morning and explained I needed someone to watch Baxter for a few days. She agreed without asking questions. I packed Baxter's food and toys and drove him to Sarah's house. He seemed happy to see her and her own dogs. Leaving him there felt like removing a weight from my chest. Now I could focus on what was about to happen without worrying about his safety. I spent the rest of the day at the police station waiting for updates. The surveillance team called in reports every few hours. 2 vehicles had been parked outside Eric's house all day. Around 6 in the evening, more cars started arriving. Detective Quigley gathered the raid team in the conference room for briefing. She showed them the layout of Eric's house and assigned positions. They would move in at exactly 10 when they expected the exchange to be happening. She wanted everyone caught in the act for the strongest possible case. I waited in a small office while the team prepared their equipment. The minutes dragged by like hours. At 9:30, Detective Quigley came to check on me one last time. She said I'd done the right thing coming forward and now they would handle the rest. The surveillance team reported 8 vehicles now at Eric's house. At exactly 10 o'clock, the raid team moved in. I could hear radio chatter from the dispatch room but couldn't make out the words. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours before Detective Quigley finally called. They'd found all 7 dogs in the basement, along with 4 men, including Eric. The organizer wasn't there, but they had his phone number from Eric's cell. All the dogs were being transported to the emergency animal shelter for evaluation. The men were in custody and would be processed at the station. She said I could come see the dogs in the morning once they'd been examined. I barely slept that night knowing those dogs were finally safe, but wondering what condition they were in. The next morning, I drove to the emergency animal shelter where the 7 rescued dogs were being held. The shelter director met me at the door and warned me about what I'd see. Each dog was in a separate kennel for evaluation. Some were worse than others, but all showed signs of trauma. One golden retriever cowered in the corner when I walked by. A German shepherd had the number 3 still visible in his shaved fur. A small terrier mix wouldn't stop shaking even with a blanket. The worst was a lab who just lay there staring at nothing. But when I knelt by each kennel and spoke softly, their tails made tiny movements. Just little twitches, but still trying to wag despite everything they'd been through. The shelter director handed me forms to sign while explaining that the dogs would need weeks of care before any could be adopted. 2 days later, Detective Quigley called to say Eric made bail and was wearing an ankle monitor that tracked his every move. She explained he was giving them names and addresses of everyone involved, and so far everything was checking out. More arrests were happening daily based on his information. My phone rang constantly with work calling about project deadlines, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets when those dogs were suffering. My boss left a voicemail saying he understood family emergencies, but the quarterly report still needed filing. I sent an email requesting unpaid leave and turned off my phone. The bills would pile up, but Baxter needed me more than my job did right now. Julia texted that she was booking the next flight from Seattle and would be here tomorrow morning. When I picked her up at the airport, she looked exhausted and angry. She hugged me tight, then immediately asked to see Baxter. We drove straight to the vet where Teresa was keeping him for observation. Julia cried when she saw the marks on his body and the way he flinched at sudden movements. We spent the rest of the day calling rescue organizations trying to find specialized help for the 7 dogs. Most places were full, but Julia kept making calls while I filled out applications. One rescue coordinator mentioned a specialist named Jasmine Hill who worked with traumatized animals. Julia got her number and I called immediately. Jasmine agreed to meet Baxter the next day for an evaluation. She arrived with a bag full of special treats and toys designed for scared dogs. She sat on the floor for 20 minutes just letting Baxter smell her before trying to touch him. She explained the peanut butter was a reward system to make them obey commands, and the sedatives kept them from fighting back. She said recovery would take months of careful work, but she could come 3 times a week. I signed the paperwork even though her fees would drain my savings. Detective Quigley called while Jasmine was working with Baxter to say they arrested the organizer in another state. Eric's information led them right to him, and they found evidence of similar operations in 3 other cities. The man had been doing this for years, and Eric was just one of many people he forced into helping. She said the case was bigger than anyone imagined, and the FBI was now involved. That night, Eric's lawyer called asking to meet about a plea deal. The prosecutor, Amos Yoon, wanted Eric to testify against everyone in exchange for reduced charges and therapy instead of prison. The lawyer said they needed my input as a victim before moving forward. I hung up without answering because I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me wanted Eric to rot in jail, but another part remembered him crying and saying he was threatened. Julia and I stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about what was right. She kept saying Eric made choices even if he was scared, but I kept thinking about the debt collectors threatening him. We went in circles for hours without deciding anything. The next morning, Detective Quigley called again to say they arrested Darius Crowder on extortion charges. He was the debt collector who threatened Eric and forced him into the dog operation. They found evidence he did this to dozens of people who owed money. His arrest would help Eric's case since it proved he was threatened, but it didn't erase what he did to those dogs. 3 weeks passed with Jasmine coming to work with Baxter every other day. He started eating from his bowl without cowering, and his tail was wagging stronger each visit. She showed me exercises to do between sessions and explained how to read his body language for stress signs. One morning, he walked straight to his food without any hesitation and ate the whole bowl. Jasmine called it a breakthrough and said his resilience was remarkable for what he went through. The court date arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, and I sat in the gallery watching them bring in the defendants. They wore orange jumpsuits and chains around their ankles as they shuffled to their seats. Eric sat at the far end of the defendant table staring at his hands. When the judge read the charges, I counted 18 different crimes, including animal abuse and trafficking. Each man had to stand and enter a plea while their lawyers spoke about bail and evidence. Eric stood when his name was called, but never looked up at me. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea and mentioned his cooperation with police. The prosecutor stood and described finding 7 dogs in Eric's basement, along with evidence of systematic abuse. He showed photos that made people in the gallery gasp. The judge set trial dates and bail amounts for each defendant. Most were denied bail, but Eric's cooperation meant he could stay on the house arrest. As they led the defendants out, Eric finally glanced at me with red eyes before guards pushed him through the door. I sat in my car afterward feeling empty and confused about seeing him in chains. Julia drove us home while I stared out the window thinking about those 7 dogs still in the shelter. Tomorrow I would visit them again and bring the special treats Jasmine recommended. The lab who wouldn't stop staring at nothing needed the most help, and I wanted to sit with him even if he didn't respond yet. The prosecutor called 2 days later asking me to come to his office, and when I walked in, he had his laptop open on the desk with a folder marked Evidence on the screen. He turned the screen away before I could see anything and told me they'd found hundreds of videos on the organizer's hard drive showing exactly what those men were doing to the dogs. I said I didn't want to see them, and he nodded, saying he understood, but the footage showed at least 12 clients clearly and would make convictions guaranteed. That afternoon, the local news ran a story about the dog trafficking bust, and within hours, the shelter got flooded with calls. A woman named Sandra drove 3 hours after recognizing one of the rescued dogs as her missing beagle Max, who disappeared from her backyard 6 months ago. She brought vet records and photos proving ownership, and when they reunited, Max started crying and spinning in circles while she sobbed into his fur. The shelter director said 2 more owners had called with similar stories, which meant these weren't strays, but stolen pets taken from families. 3 weeks later, I sat in a small room with 12 strangers while the prosecutor explained what a grand jury was and why my testimony mattered. My hands shook as I described finding Baxter in Eric's basement with that tool in his mouth, the 7 dogs numbered and sitting in formation, the man behind the wall groaning. I talked for 2 hours answering questions about dates and times and what exactly I saw, and when I finished the jury, Foreman said they had enough for multiple felony indictments. Eric's lawyer called that night saying his therapist wanted to reach out through proper channels about Eric's progress in the court-mandated program. The therapist sent a letter explaining how Eric was starting to understand the manipulation tactics the organizer used, how debt and fear made him vulnerable to coercion. It didn't fix what he did, but knowing he was getting help meant something. 4 months after everything started, I was playing with Baxter in the backyard when I called his name, and he spun around instantly, running straight to me with his old energy. Jasmine had been coming twice a week working on his responses, and this was the first time he reacted without any delay or hesitation. She watched from the porch and pumped her fist, saying this was the breakthrough she'd been waiting for, that his brain was finally overriding the conditioning. Detective Quigley called with news that the organizer took a plea deal, 15 years in federal prison instead of potential life in exchange for names and locations of every operation he knew about. She said his information was already leading to raids in 4 states and would shut down networks that had been operating for years. The courtroom was packed for Eric's sentencing hearing 6 weeks later. The judge read through his cooperation with authorities, his lack of prior record, and the evidence of coercion before announcing 2 years probation with intensive supervision, 500 hours of community service at animal shelters, and mandatory therapy twice a week. Eric had to pay $10,000 in restitution split between all the victims and would have monthly drug tests and home visits. It felt both too light for what those dogs suffered and appropriate given how he'd been threatened and manipulated into participating. My boss called the next morning saying I could return to work part-time with flexible scheduling to accommodate Baxter's ongoing therapy appointments. My coworkers welcomed me back with a card and flowers, but I could see the way they looked at me differently, like I was fragile or dangerous or both. The woman in the next cubicle kept asking if I was okay every hour until I had to tell her to stop. The shelter called with updates on the rescued dogs, and over the next month 6 of them found specialized homes with families trained in trauma recovery. The 7th dog, a German shepherd who still wouldn't let anyone touch him, went to a sanctuary in the mountains that worked exclusively with severely abused animals. They sent photos showing him in a huge fenced area with other dogs, not ready for a home but safe, and getting daily care from specialists. Julia flew in again, and we sat at my kitchen table figuring out how to handle Eric going forward. We decided on strict boundaries where we'd take 1 call per month to check his progress, but no visits, no holidays, no family dinners until further notice. When we told him over the phone, he just said okay without arguing or trying to negotiate, which felt like the first real sign he understood the damage he'd caused. The community center smelled like old coffee and floor wax when I walked in for my first support group meeting 3 weeks later. 8 people sat in a circle of folding chairs, and each one had the same tired look I saw in my mirror every morning. The facilitator handed me a packet about pet trauma recovery, and I found myself nodding along as a woman described finding her cat after it escaped from a breeding mill. Her hands shook holding her coffee cup the same way mine did when I talked about Baxter's rescue. Another man talked about his dog being used for illegal fighting and how it took 6 months before the dog would let anyone touch him without flinching. We met every Tuesday, and just having people who understood why I checked on Baxter 5 times a night helped more than any regular therapy could. That same week, I was sitting on the living room floor sorting mail when Baxter walked over with his old tennis ball in his mouth. He dropped it right at my feet and backed up with his tail wagging, ready to play fetch for the first time since everything started. My throat got tight watching him bounce on his front paws like he used to do before Eric got involved. We played for 20 minutes straight, and he kept bringing the ball back with more energy each time. Jasmine had warned me this breakthrough might come suddenly, but seeing him act like himself again made me sit on the floor and cry while he licked my face. Detective Quigley called the next morning saying they got a warrant for the storage unit Eric rented 6 months ago. The police found boxes of training manuals, shock collars, conditioning equipment, and notebooks with detailed records of every dog that went through the program. Photos showed at least 30 different dogs over 2 years, with notes about their progress and which clients preferred which types of training. The prosecutor said this evidence alone would add years to sentences and help them identify 12 more people buying these services. My phone buzzed with a Facebook message from an account with no profile picture saying I better watch my back for ruining people's lives. The message included details about where I worked and what car I drove, which made my hands shake as I screenshot everything. Detective Quigley came to my apartment within an hour and traced the account to one of the convicted clients who thought he could scare me into dropping charges. She filed new charges for witness intimidation and said his bail would definitely get revoked for this. The security company installed cameras at my apartment that afternoon and gave me a panic button to carry. Eric called from the dog rescue where he was doing community service to tell me he'd finished his first 100 hours of work. The director got on the phone saying Eric showed up early every shift and worked harder than most volunteers despite not being allowed near any animals. He cleaned kennels, fixed fences, organized supply rooms, and never complained about any task they gave him. She said he seemed to really understand what he'd done wrong and was trying to make things right the only way he could. 5 months after finding Baxter in that basement, I finally felt ready to try the dog park near my apartment. Baxter pressed against my leg when we walked through the gate and watched the other dogs running around. A golden retriever came over to sniff him, and Baxter's tail started wagging slowly. Within 10 minutes, he was chasing a border collie around the agility equipment and wrestling with a beagle over a rope toy. Other owners commented on how happy he looked, and I just smiled instead of explaining why this moment meant everything. The local news picked up the story that week, calling it the biggest animal trafficking bust in state history. They interviewed Detective Quigley about the investigation without using our names, but Eric's role as a cooperating witness became public anyway. His old co-workers started posting about feeling betrayed, and his college friends unfriended him on social media. Eric texted me that he deserved the backlash and wouldn't hide from what he'd done. The reporter also interviewed Teresa Hart about the medical evidence, and she explained how systematic conditioning affected the dog's stress hormones and behavior patterns. 2 weeks later, Teresa testified at the main trial and walked the jury through every injury she documented on the rescued dogs. She brought charts showing injection sites, stress markers in blood work, and photos of physical trauma from the conditioning tools. The defense lawyer tried to argue the dogs weren't seriously harmed, but Teresa's medical expertise shut down every argument. She stopped by my apartment afterward to check on Baxter and kept saying how amazed she was at his recovery compared to where he started. The prosecutor said her testimony got them 3 guilty verdicts that day. My phone rang while I was grocery shopping, and a woman introduced herself as the owner of another rescued dog. She thanked me for being brave enough to call the police that night because her dog Max had been missing for 3 months before the raid. We met at a coffee shop downtown and spent 2 hours comparing what our dogs went through and how they were recovering. She showed me videos of Max learning to trust people again, and I showed her Baxter playing at the dog park. We started meeting every week to let our dogs play together while we talked through the trauma of what happened to them. Amos Yoon called from the prosecutor's office saying they were drafting new guidelines for animal trafficking cases based on how we handled evidence collection. He said our case would become training material for other prosecutors dealing with similar crimes because the documentation and cooperation set new standards for conviction rates. The manual would include sections on working with veterinary experts, protecting witnesses from intimidation, and using financial records to track criminal networks. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived with Eric's name in the return address corner. My hands shook as I opened it and found 4 pages of handwritten text. He started by saying this letter was part of his therapy program, but he meant every word. He wrote about how his gambling started small with fantasy football, then grew into sports betting and casino trips. The losses piled up faster than he could track them, and soon he owed $30,000 to people who didn't accept payment plans. They came to his house one night and gave him 2 choices. He could work off the debt their way, or they'd take everything including his kneecaps. The dog training started as just teaching basic commands, but they kept pushing for more extreme conditioning. He knew it was wrong, but felt trapped between hurting animals and getting hurt himself. The letter ended with him saying he understood if I never forgave him, but wanted me to know how sorry he was for what he did to Baxter. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer without responding. 2 days later, Jasmine called to say Baxter was ready to graduate from his intensive therapy program. We'd been going 3 times a week for months, and now he only needed monthly maintenance visits. She met us in the lobby with a certificate that said, Graduate of Trauma Recovery Program, with Baxter's name printed in fancy letters. He sat perfectly still while she explained his progress to me. His stress responses had dropped by 80%, and his trust behaviors were almost back to normal levels. She said most dogs never recovered this well from systematic conditioning, but Baxter had shown amazing strength. He wagged his tail when she handed me his graduation treats, and for the first time it looked like his old full-body wiggle. That same week, the prosecutor called with news about the final trial verdicts. The last 3 clients had been convicted on all charges after a 2-week trial. Amos said that brought the total to 18 people facing prison time or probation for their involvement in the trafficking ring. The judge gave the harshest sentences to the organizer and his main associates, while the clients got lighter punishments based on their level of participation. Detective Quigley sent me the final case summary, showing how our local bust had completely destroyed the network in our region. She warned that similar operations still existed in other cities, but at least we'd saved dozens of dogs from this particular group. I decided to visit the shelter where Eric was doing his community service hours. The director knew our history, but said Eric had mentioned wanting me to see a particular dog. She led me to a kennel where an older golden retriever was sleeping on a worn blanket. His name was Murphy, and he'd been there for 6 months because people wanted younger dogs. The director said Murphy was calm and gentle and might help Baxter feel more secure having a friend. I filled out the adoption paperwork while Murphy sniffed my hands through the fence. When I brought him home, Baxter circled him carefully before deciding he was safe. Within an hour, they were sharing the same dog bed with Murphy's head resting on Baxter's back. Watching them become friends showed me something important about moving forward. Julia called that night to tell me she'd started volunteering with an organization that tracked missing pets. They monitored online sales, suspicious breeding operations, and helped families search for stolen animals. She spent 10 hours a week checking databases and following up on tips from concerned citizens. She said channeling her anger about Eric into something useful helped her process what our family had been through. The organization had already reunited 3 dogs with their owners based on her research into social media pet sales. She was also working with them to push for stronger laws against animal trafficking in our state. Eric texted me the following week, asking if he could see Baxter once to apologize directly. His message was short and didn't pressure me, but said he understood if I said no. I stared at the text for 20 minutes before typing my response. Some boundaries needed to stay firm no matter how much therapy he completed. I told him no, and that this decision was final. He replied with just, "I understand completely," and didn't contact me again about it. His therapist called later to say Eric had accepted my decision without anger or attempts to negotiate, which showed real progress from his old patterns. The 6-month anniversary of finding Baxter in that basement passed without me realizing it at first. I was folding laundry when it hit me that I hadn't had nightmares about that night in over 2 weeks. My therapist had been right about trauma fading slowly over time. The images were still there when I thought about them, but they didn't control my sleep anymore. The memory existed as something that happened rather than something still happening to me every night. Murphy helped too because his calm presence seemed to tell Baxter that our house was safe now. My boss called me into her office the next Monday with news about a promotion. The company was opening a new branch office 3 states away and wanted me to run the entire operation. It meant a huge salary increase and a fresh start in a place with no bad memories. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds before accepting. Baxter and Murphy both needed new surroundings as much as I did. The moving company came 2 weeks later to pack everything while I met with Detective Quigley one final time. She bought me coffee and told me our case had led to something bigger than we'd imagined. The evidence we'd gathered had convinced federal authorities to create a task force specifically for animal trafficking crimes. They were using our case as a training model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar networks. What started as me trying to save my dog had ended up protecting countless animals across multiple states. She shook my hand and said she'd never forget how brave I was that night walking into Eric's basement. The week before we moved, Julia sent me a photo from Eric's probation meeting. He'd completed all his requirements 3 months early through good behavior and extra volunteer hours. The judge officially ended his supervision, and Eric was working a regular accounting job at a nonprofit that helped gambling addicts. Julia said he seemed different when they talked, quieter and more thoughtful than before. She thought maybe people really could change after hitting rock bottom hard enough. I looked at the photo of Eric in his business clothes outside the courthouse and felt something between sadness and hope. 3 weeks later, I drove past Eric's old house on my way to pick up the last boxes from storage. The for sale sign stuck in the front yard had a pending sticker across it. I slowed down just enough to see workers carrying paint cans through the front door. That basement where everything happened would become someone else's game room or storage space soon. Places don't hold evil, though. People do, and those people had faced their consequences. The moving truck arrived at our new place 2 days after Baxter and I got there. We'd driven 12 hours straight to a small town 3 states away where nobody knew our story. Baxter spent the first hour sniffing every corner of the empty house before the movers arrived. His tail started wagging when he found the sunny spot by the living room window. Not the careful wag he'd learned to do on command, but the full body wiggle that used to knock things off coffee tables. I watched him explore each room with real curiosity, instead of the fear I'd seen for months. The movers set up my bed first, and Baxter immediately jumped on it to claim his spot. By evening, we had boxes everywhere, but Baxter seemed happy just having his toys and food bowls in familiar spots. That first night, he slept through without whimpering once. My phone buzzed the next morning with a text from Julia. She'd attached a photo of Eric standing outside a community center, wearing a button-down shirt and holding a certificate. Eric graduated from his therapy program today, she wrote. The sign behind him said something about addiction recovery services. He was going to work with an organization helping gambling addicts avoid his path. I stared at the photo for a while before deleting it. Using his story to warn others felt like the right kind of penance for what he'd done. 2 weeks into our new life, I had to find a vet for Baxter's checkup. The clinic downtown had good reviews, so I made an appointment with Dr. Brennan. She examined Baxter while commenting on how calm and well-adjusted he seemed for a dog in a new place. Most dogs are nervous their first visit, but yours seems really comfortable with people, she said while checking his teeth. I just nodded and didn't mention our history. We weren't defined by what happened to us anymore, but by how we'd recovered and moved forward. She gave him a clean bill of health and a new tag with our local address. Spring turned to summer and then fall in our new town. Baxter and I developed routines that had nothing to do with our past. Morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoon naps in the sunny spot, evening fetch in the backyard. One day at the dog park, a man in a business suit walked past us on his way to work. A year ago, that would have sent Baxter into panic mode. Now he didn't even look up from the stick he was chewing. The trigger that once made him shake meant nothing anymore. Recovery wasn't just an idea, it was happening every single day in small ways. I saw a flyer at the pet store for a local dog training club that met Saturday mornings. We showed up the next week to find about 20 dogs and their owners practicing in a big field. The instructor showed us the agility course with jumps, tunnels, and weave poles. Baxter took to it immediately, racing through the obstacles with pure joy on his face. Watching him jump through hoops because he wanted to, not because someone conditioned him to, felt like winning. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was actually thriving. The other owners complimented his natural ability and asked about his training background. I just said we were new to agility and left it at that. 6 months after moving, a thick envelope arrived with Eric's return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain notebook paper. He wrote that he'd met someone at his recovery meetings who knew his whole history and accepted him anyway. They were taking things slow, but it felt healthy and honest. He'd been sober from gambling for 18 months and planned to keep it that way. His community service was done, but he still volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. He understood why I couldn't forgive him yet, and maybe never would. He just wanted me to know he was trying to be better every day. I read it twice before putting it in a drawer. That evening, Baxter and I took our usual walk through the neighborhood as the sun went down. He sniffed every tree and mailbox like they held the secrets of the universe. His tail never stopped wagging the entire walk. A neighbor waved from their porch and Baxter trotted over for pets without hesitation. We were both different from before this whole thing started. The trust issues, the nightmares, the anger, they were all still there under the surface. But we were okay with being different. Actually, we were better than okay. We were genuinely happy and free in a way I didn't think would be possible a year ago. And that's the story. I always look forward to your takes in the comments. Don't hold back, I'll be checking through them.